Australian National University 1. And from side negative, we have the Indira Gandhi National Open University, RAV. I'm joined by a lovely panel of 4 other judges. We'll introduce ourselves and then we'll, I guess, go on with the debate. If speakers want to introduce themselves before their speeches for the sake of the ballot, that would be appreciated as well. We'll collect motion videos, I think, also just before everything ends. But I'm August, I'm the chair of this open semi-final, and I wish you the best of luck. Joining me on the panel from the left to right, we have...
Hi, I'm John. Good luck, everyone.
Daisy, good luck, everyone.
I'm Leah. Good luck, everyone.
Oh, there.
I think there'll be usual proceedings, time kept, bell at 6, bell at 8, and bell at 8:15. Could I just grab the affirmative veto before we start?
We vetoed the top one.
Egypt, and then Meg vetoed the third one. So for everyone who isn't following, we're doing motion 2, that we support the one army plan in Syria. Without further ado, I'd love to welcome up first affirmative to open up this debate. Here!
Some context to frame this. Syria is an incredibly diverse country demographically. Colonialism and borders drawn arbitrarily by colonial powers divided up these groups in incredibly crazy ways. Only 60% of the population is the biggest group that exists. They are Sunni Muslims. There are also Alawites, the Assad government, they're about 10%. Otherwise, you've got Druze, some Turkey people, and Kurds as well. In the Civil War, there were these many groups. These look like Sharaa and the group won, but there were many diverse groups. Many of them still have control of certain places, even if not regions, at least towns, and that's important to note. Secondly, we support this policy. They obviously do not support this policy. We'll let them define what it is. We can ask about it regardless. 4 things to say. First one is de-escalate conflict. Secondly, why it's good for Syria long term. Thirdly, why it's good for investment. Fourthly, why it's good for the region. Let's start with de-escalation. Why does Sharaa do this well? That is to say, firstly, in the info slide, they explain this is going to be offered to everyone, and that explanation is that it's going to be done to all militias, which suggests that it is going to be done fairly, applied fairly and equally across the board as an offer. And that's what it is. Secondly, though, Sharaa has been in since the end of 2024 or thereabouts, and incredibly good for Syria. They've done a number of good things so far. That looks like putting more women into government, supporting democratic elections, and Syria has been seeking things like more West support, more support from the EU in this time. These are things that Sharaa has done in order to aim for this as well, to get more cooperation and less sanctions from the West. But they've done substantial amounts of rebuilding. Obviously, Sharaa has an incentive to push this policy, which is why they're doing it. But also, we explained that the next thing to explain is that actually this government is stable at the moment, but obviously it's not going to do this policy in a way that we make things more unstable, and therefore we do it equally and in many ways fairly. Why do militias then accept the deals that they are offered? First is to say that it's actually a pretty good deal. I reckon amnesty for stepping down does seem pretty good. But I would suggest it probably does just lead to things like less fighting occurring anyway. But also, they are going to get more involvement in the next government, which is something that the militia groups who have various interests from different backgrounds, but also different regional desires for control, for desires to support the region or the city they come from, do want more power within the state, do want this more backing. And they are unlikely to have substantial kind of a vision that they want to then take control over military power. Many of these groups exist in small places in towns or regions. Does suggest they kept these areas on like seizing control overall. Does suggest that they're able to get some level of control of the government, they then are able to use that control to do good things. And we explain the next thing here is that even if only some take the deal, it incentivizes others to then take the deal. That is to say, if one militia or a few militia groups take this deal, this Sharaa government can spend more time dealing with other militias. They know the threat to them is larger, with more concentrated resources on them as well. But even some people within the deal take the amnesty, within the group take the deal for amnesty. That means that that group is more fractured. You know that people are going to be defecting. You know that your group may lose power over time. Incentivizes the entire other militias more. Gives you great incentive to take the deal. What are the impacts of this? Firstly, is to say these groups are incredibly violent and disarming them is incredibly important. They've done large amounts of violence against a number of other ethnic minorities, they've done embargoes, they've hurt regions, they've prevented things getting into do reviewing, they've prevented things getting into place to support them. But next, we explain that demilitarisation here is good. That is, that less guns that exist in Syria is good because they don't fall into the hands of other people and it's harder for other people to commit violence against others. But it also means it's harder, it stops reform. It makes, if militias want to reform, it makes it harder for them to continue and escalate conflict into the future because their arms have been taken away. But we explain next, it would probably increase the Sharaa focus on doing positive things. They're worrying less about fighting this war, about fighting against militias. They're focusing on the rebuilding that they are doing. They're not focusing on this group, and they don't have to be as dictatorial because they feel these groups are less of a threat to them now that they don't exist. Meaning they can be more supportive of things like democracy. And less time and resources are really good. Less lives are lost, that's really important. Second claim then on long-term governance of Syria. Syria's traditional issue is, as I framed at the start, partly about the diversity of this country and the amount of diversity that is not represented within the main government that has existed for a long time, which has been ruled by a singular group for a while. And that just suggests that people have been incredibly unhappy about that. So we explain this leads to more diverse representation in the government. In that, firstly, is the principal benefit of these groups being represented. But secondly, it is important for these groups to feel that the Syrian state is working towards a constructive and collectively whole Syria that does support each of these minority groups and does not discriminate against others because one is in charge. They do not see others in groups, the other one is in charge. We think this means that there's more trust of them in institutions, but also it does minimise the historical divide. Historical divides that flare up in forms of ethnic conflict and can lead to greater numbers of wars in the future, and that is important. But next, we explain this is likely to is incredibly important because of historical turmoil. The consequences of lacking diversity in the government, having a single minority group that rules a very diverse country, has led to a number of these sorts of harms, has led to groups fighting against each other in wars and while on the other side. Impact of this is to say that the stable government and the stable military of Syria is incredibly good. That means they're more likely to act in the interest of all the people rather than the interest of a singular minority group and oppress others. And that is something that is about becoming a new identity, having checks and balances on each other and all that incredibly good as well. Next thing is that you get more investment in Syria from external actors here, and that is because investors have been cautious to enter or re-enter Syria due to the fragile nature and the diversity of militias. Militias that can bomb infrastructure that gets built, militias that can block things getting into certain places, militias that can cause hold-ups to the investment doing good things in certain regions or cities. And that's the threat of a war or a conflict starting up again means that their investment is unstable, is unlikely to develop these sorts of returns, or likely to work out well in the long run. Does it suggest that people can be cautious from cautious of investing? But we also suggest that other governments in the region, like in surrounding areas, are unsure about the success of each individual militia, and so they're unlikely to back any individual one, and more likely to back the government as a whole when it's representative of all these militias. Next, the impact of this is to say that Syria was devastated by war. It's a big country with many natural resources and a large population that can all be tapped into. This improves people's lives, it gives them more employment, it gives them more things and food and development, and adheres to becoming a more developed country, and a country where people have better lives. It's a massive impact that we lay on this debate. Next, on regional cooperation. Some militias have annoyed other governments in regions due to their cross-border activity that often antagonises and just does damage to other neighbouring countries. And this looks like certain Islamist groups have reported. But we also, and that's why certain surrounding countries are likely to support this de-escalation, support this disarming of militias. But also, a more representative Syrian government likely means that you get more international connection with the diversity of players in the region. That looks like Shia being connected, Shia Muslims being connected more with Iran. It looks like Druze being more connected or softening with Israel. It looks like the West backing other groups in Syria. And the plurality of ideological interests means you're contributing to working with everyone. Ideology is not preventing you from working with certain countries, and it means you're working with different actors. And it probably also, at the very least, it means you're being less oppositional to them. You are more likely to support peace across the region. That just suggests Syria benefits because you've got more cooperation and benefits from other countries, but it's probably also good for the surrounding region. You can host peace talks, you can host those negotiations, you can work to meet actors where they are, improve those regional peace that occurs there as well, and support growth across the region. Just for those 4 reasons, very, very bad for us.
affirmative says that this policy will be applied fairly. The problem is they never identify what really is fair on their side of the policy. Why is it fair that some groups may receive amnesty? Because I want you to know the motion clearly says that they may receive amnesty. This is not certain on their side. Of course, this will be conditional on some things or the other, likely on which group is likely to side with the Al-Sharaa government or not. But the second problem is, why is it fair that when groups say no, you're going to actively going to disarm them and you're going to disband them? So it's quite unclear on their side as to why this policy is fair, quote unquote, as they say it is. But the bigger problem is, they assume that most of these groups are simply going to surrender their arms and they're going to fall under this policy. But I want you to note, Affirmative team never proved this. So the downstream impacts of less military is good, more representation is good in the government, and there's more cooperation in the region is quite unclear, because they never explain why this policy will be implemented in such a manner where most of the groups fall under this. We would argue that maybe you can coerce some groups to fall under this policy, but that is exactly what triggers a larger civil war, where groups fight against each other, and this leads to civil disturbances, which is just bad for people, and that's something they concede to. I want to be very clear about the status quo here, and to be honest, this is not status quo. I know Vishwa has a matter file that's filled with random ass fucking stuff. This is actually being useful for once in our life. The frame is, there are multiple ethnic groups in Syria, but these groups aren't just part of Syria. These groups like the Alawites, Kurds, and Druze consider themselves to be autonomous regions, and they consider the Al-Sharaa government to only be operating in Baghdad and be the legitimate government of that region, but not their autonomous regions. What this means is that when Al-Sharaa presents a policy like this, all of these groups consider it to be illegitimate, because these ethnic groups consider the Al-Sharaa government itself to be illegitimate. There are two reasons for why these groups are quite scared of this government and they don't want to accept this policy. The first is that when Assad flew away, Al-Sharaa captured the capital city, but it did not capture all of the autonomous regions, even though it created some binding agreements with these autonomous regions and their representative governments to give them some money from the oil revenues they were extracting there. They never became part of Syria. This means they just considered the capital to be illegitimate. They don't believe they're part of Syria. The second is they're just afraid that policies that were followed in the time of Assad and his dad would be repeated, where they had peace talks with these groups in 2003, but then later on dropped bombs onto these regions under the disguise that ISIS is operating there. So for both of these reasons, both of these groups are all three groups that Affirmative says does live in these regions are quite skeptical of this government and if it truly represents them. Most of these groups believe that they live in their own autonomous regions and that they have autonomy over them. I'm going to give you 4 specific reasons as to why these groups will not accept this deal, and I want to be clear, even though this is not OIV knowledge, insofar as a debater tells you about this information, you ought to credit it and consider it into the debate, but after that I'll give structural reasoning as well. The first reason is the Alawites. They took up arms and they made their own militias because they were massacred by Bashar al-Assad because of the fact that they're Shia. But they actively continue to fight any of the wars because they have resources to do so. They're funded by Iran because Iran gets to benefit from the trade routes that come under the autonomous regions of Alawites. This means insofar as they keep getting funding, the Alawites control the trade routes, they control this power, and they want to be autonomous. They don't want to accept this policy. The second is the Kurdish group. They are backed by the Syrian Democratic Forces and they reject to be integrated. Previous offers had been made to this group to be integrated with the army, but they rejected this because they never got funding for the Kurdish socialist movement. So they realized that we might be integrated within the army and we might be offered amnesty, but they knew that they wouldn't get any political representation whatsoever, because of which they have already rejected some similar deals before. The third group is the Druze, who have also always considered themselves to be an autonomous region, and this was the case under Al-Sharaa and Assad as well. So insofar as they have historically rejected to be part of the Syrian government that is illegitimate according to them, this team has to do a lot more work in terms of explaining why all of a sudden they want to fall under Syria and consider themselves to be legitimate part of it. The fourth reason is, honestly, all of them just hate this government because a big part of this government is Al-Jalali, who is the prime minister of the current transitional government. He was also part of Assad's regime, and he was pro crackdown on these groups during Assad's time. So these people have remnant feelings about the current prime minister. They're really distrustful of this. But even if, and this is the worst case, you should credit these reasons because they are in Vishwa's matter file and he has done a lot of work in that. But even if you discredit all of this, there are 3 structural reasons as to why these groups will probably never accept this policy. The first one is that the moment at which they accept this policy, they lose their leverage because they don't have the military advantage anymore to protect themselves. They can't for political representation, the point at which they're part of the military, but they're not part of the political structure. They're part of the military that might be used to oppress their people whenever they try to protest. So because of this reason, they don't want to lose their leverage. This is the only leverage they've had till now. And I want to be very clear here. These groups have been under attack for decades from different regimes that have been in power from time to time, and the only reason they have been able to survive is because of their arms. This government tells them, give up your arms and you'll be fine. But this group doesn't know if it will be fine because it was never fine before. So insofar as they lose their leverage, they're going to not want to accept this deal. The second is that this policy has an active threat of disarmament, which suggests that the Al-Sharaa government doesn't want to negotiate with these groups and live peacefully with them. It clearly suggests that it wants to dictate because it's unconditional. If you do not give up, we will take you down. We are going to get into your villages, we are going to gun you down, we are going to arm more of our people, and we are going to take you down. This clearly indicates that Al-Sharaa doesn't want to cooperate with them, and this is clearly something the groups wouldn't want, given that the only thing they have been fighting for decades on end is their own autonomy. The third reason is just they have recruited a lot of people in the past to protect themselves, and the only rhetoric they could have used is that we are claiming autonomy. We are fighting for our own land that is trying to be stolen by Syrian leaders. The point at which they let go of all of the people they have recruited and they surrender to the Syrian government that's trying to implement this policy, they give up their idea that we are autonomous regions, which removes all of their ability to recruit anyone in the future. This is clearly bad for them. They lose all political representation, they lose all military representation, which has been the only countervailing effect to the Syrian government. For these three structural reasons, these groups will never accept the policy. What I've proven this till now is that these groups will not accept the deal because they feel threatened. The impacts of this are quite clear and quite simple, and you should write them in the debate, and these are important because Affirmative says that these are bad things as well. I think on their side, what you do is the threat creates an active incentive for these groups to buy more arms, to recruit more people, and to counter Al-Sharaa's threat. The militias just increase in size and power, and the capacity for them clearly exists given that they're already being empowered by proxy nations that want to fight the wars in these areas, especially for religious reasons. What this creates is more tension in the region. It also incentivizes Al-Sharaa to see these military groups as a threat, to militarize further and actively attack them before they are provoked in the first place. I think more instability in this region is good because millions of people die. Why? Two reasons. The first is that there's just more violence in these groups, more guns in hands of people who don't know how to use them. They kill people. That's bad. And the second is that there's just lesser money left for welfare because more of the money is being spent on buying arms, which means you can't spend as much on getting food anymore. This is the kind of world that Affirmative has to defend. A world in which children go hungry every single day, where people are displaced from their homes and forced to live in subhumane conditions, where schools and hospitals are shut down, or in a lot of instances, bombed down, which is just worse, and children are encouraged to take up arms because they're told this is the only way you can protect yourself, this is the only way you can protect your land. In an incredibly sensitive region, I would argue this is the worst policy possible, because this is a policy that takes autonomy of these groups that have been suppressed for decades with vague promises of amnesty, but also threats of disarmament and disbandment. Not only is this a principle wrong, I would argue that this is practically stupid as well, given that it leads to more instability in the region. The comparative is quite simple. We support status quo, where you do have autonomous regions for these ethnic groups. That team has a high burden to prove why these groups will be safe, why they will be politically represented, and why they will not take up arms to protect themselves like they have been doing so for decades.
I would like to thank the last native speaker for that speech. To continue the substantive portion of side affirmative's case, second affirmative. Here.
Syria cannot function if it is a country with independent autonomous regions. It is basically just letting them live. At some point, integration is needed. Integration is needed to ensure that people have access to amenities, to services that were destroyed during 13 years under Assad. Integration is needed to ensure that the current regimes that rule these areas do not continue to, because this team says they want, autonomy. I'm deeply unconvinced that the people do, and I think that what is best for them is a unified government that can represent and look after them. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the implementation of this policy, and secondly, I'm going to talk about the reasons they explain groups won't sign on and the potential harms of that. Firstly, they say you're not going to give amnesty to all. I think there's an obvious incentive to do so, and I actually don't think they lead to any, such an impact to that. And that's just because to not do so kind of would undermine the whole point. If you promise one group amnesty and then they give up and then you don't actually give it to them, no one else is going to do that, so the incentive is very clearly to do that. But also, Sharaa is obviously, as we explained first, in a position where he is attempting to build good faith, both with the people of the country and with international actors, which means that he is likely to do this in a way that follows through on whatever deal is agreed to. This group says that lots of groups view Sharaa as illegitimate and they want to hold on to their autonomous regions so that they don't do this. But I would just say the majority of Syrians don't care about who looks after them as long as they are looked after. Most Syrians have lived through 13 to 14 years of people dying, of a significant proportion of their population having to flee into Lebanon or into the EU and now returning to a country that they hope can be unified. I don't think that they mind too much whether or not Sharaa is legitimate or not. He is not Assad. He is not someone who is actively hurting them, and he is hoping to promise them jobs, to promise them economic opportunity, to promise them the ability to feel safe again. And that just comes first for everyone. I think very few people are ideologically persistent enough to say, well, I want to live in this, autonomous region of Syria as it is, and I just think that most people actually do support this, and that the groups that rule there therefore have to, when an option is presented, they are pushed to, because if not, the people say that is what they want, they give Assad the permission to come in, and the people do not have soldiers in their armies to fight and go against that, and integration does occur. The second thing is that they say you're viewed as illegitimate because you're not given a seat at the table. Our whole case is that this is the very mechanism by which you give people a seat at the table. Because under that said, when is anyone ever going to get a seat at the table? Why do you not just have the Sharaa government that is viewed as illegitimate in perpetuity forever because it does not represent the minorities in this region? It is under our side that you are offered a seat at the table. They say it's unclear that you will get political involvement. Oh my god, I think it is significantly likely. If you have involvement in the military, I think that you are also likely to have political involvement. The military, particularly in Syria, is often quite linked to politics as well. But also, obviously, if you remove the barriers that exist in autonomous regions, those regions are more integrated into the centralised government. They're more likely to be able to do things like vote and participate and have representation there, and so are likely to do so. So I think this is how you make it incredibly legitimate. But the third thing I would say is that this team just relies on a comparative that they do not discuss and do not prove. They say Sharaa is going to let these regions just sit there autonomously, which I think, they could try and prove that, but if he's going to do that, then he's probably going to give them relative autonomy under our side of the house as well, right? He knows it's in his interest and he knows it's in the interest of stability, which means that this deal looks like, hey, give over your guns, you're still going to have relatively strong, independent, state-based government, but you're going to have a seat at the table in the federal government as well. Or, if he's anti these regions under our side and wants to obliterate any sense of regional identity or autonomy, he's probably going to do the same thing under their side and at some point send the guns in. And I think that is obviously in his incentive, because in Syria, these groups operating is just a threat to him. This is, as they say, a potential threat at any point of civil war. And these groups are often violent. They do things like bomb, bigger cities. They do things like prevent infrastructure and prevent the sort of investment that we talked to you about at SAM. They do things like allow foreign states to have an interest in Syria, and that means that his incentive for unification is relatively strong. Under their side, they send if you think that they send send the military in, they send it in all instances, which is worse, because it is firstly less likely to be successful if it's dispersed amongst a different array of places, but secondly, it is just worse because you have less peaceful, handing over of guns and etc. Under our side, maybe not all the autonomous regions, give it up. I think a lot of them would because the people would like them to, but under our side, at the very least, you don't have to fight across all of them in a way that is unguaranteed to succeed. What reasons do they give as to why these groups are unlikely to sign on? Firstly, they say you're likely to lose leverage because you're only part of the military and not in politics. I think I've just explained that political involvement is significantly likely, and that if Sharaa knows this is a disincentive for people signing on, he's likely to, again, offer a degree of political autonomy as part of, this agreement and allow them to operate in that way. Secondly, they say that the threat of disarmament is really bad. We say that this is often an incentive for a lot of people to say yes. These groups being armoured is not in the interest of the people of Syria. These groups are not always good, and they do rule over regions that are diverse, and they do lead to people feeling scared. Living in a region where the group looking after a region is armoured means that your children on the way to school, are seeing guns around. They feel like they're still living in a state of war and a militarised sense. I think that people are okay with disarmament. If there are small groups that want to hold out, I think they cannot do so without a popular base supporting them, allowing them to fight, etc. Finally, they say that that they only have popularity because of their promise of autonomy, but I think that that's untrue. I think, as I've suggested, people don't care too much about autonomy. They've just experienced 13 years of war on the promise of some degree, on ideology, on various things. They are over that. They want to live relatively good lives. but I just would suggest the impact of this is pretty weak. The impact is exclusively that you're going to militarise more because you fear the threat of Sharaa, but I would just question why these groups aren't maximally militarised already, and why if they could be buying guns and had the money to and the resources to, they wouldn't under either side when there is evidently threat, and if it is so important to them, it is existential. I think that threat exists significantly. Let's talk about what we've proved in this debate. I think firstly, our claim doesn't rely on all these groups being, heads of autonomous regions. They suggest there are a couple. I would say there are also just ranging militias that exist in Syrian towns who do not care about this, who are just Islamists, who have been holding out and who have done bad things and are worried about prosecution, and we give them a way out, a way to hand over their guns and ensure that they are no longer in the community. And we explain that they'll be exceptionally likely to take that, not only because of the threat that is attached to this, that this team recognises is considered a threat for a lot of people, but additionally because it ensures that they are not going to be prosecuted, and because it gives them the positive of being able to live a free life and being able to be in government. And I think that is incredibly persuasive to them. But I think additionally that explains why they're likely to hand over their guns. We attach a range of positive impacts to that. Even if you think some groups do not agree to doing this, it is important that a few of them do, because that is safety in those areas, that is safety that accrues to the people, and that is greater surety in a Syrian government that one day can represent a unified Syrian people. Happy to propose.
Thank you, second affirmative. To continue the case, the substantive portion of the side negative's case, I welcome up second negative. Here.
Syria has seen relative peace in the last 2 years because after Assad flew away to Russia, there is an already existing deal between all of them, even verbal, but it exists. All of them are still operating their own oil wells, their own resources. They are giving a cut of this well to the existing central government in Baghdad, and they are making sure that there is absolutely no physical violence between these groups. Yes, there are small instances of violence, but after the regime ended in 2024, the violence has been significantly lesser, comparatively much smaller, and located in very, very small areas where groups are still fighting because they are extreme militias. These extreme militias won't give in on both sides of the house because they are extreme and not reasonable. For reasonable militias, it's just quite likely that they are catering to their own people. The second thing I want to point out is that the reason why the civil war lasted for such a long period of time is because these large militias have somewhat similar powers. So even if the existing group in the center is quite powerful, the other groups aren't really stupid. Some of them are backed by Iran because they are Shias, and Iran wants to make sure that they have all the arms possible to fight them. But because also Iran has a Shia crescent where these regions surround the route through which Iran transports its oil, and therefore is quite useful to Iran. And these are reasons as to why these groups are still funded quite well. They still have arms and ammunition, and they could fight if it needs to be. The reason as to why there has been relative peace is because all parties recognize this, and all parties therefore are stable within their groups, within their autonomous regions. There is no instigation that is present right now due to which they will start attacking each other, or due to which they would start rearmament and would start recruiting a lot of people. In the last 2 years, within all these areas, Kurds and like the Shias, all of them have made sure that children go back to school, because a lot of the people who are recruited within these armies are just normal people who have families. Almost all the people within the Shia communities contributed at least one person to this existing militia to make sure that all their families are safe. And these militias do care about these families, and they do want to protect them because of at least one person from every family being there. All of these are good reasons as to why they care, and they have incentives to make sure that they reopen schools within their own area. They reopen hospitals within their own area, which has been happening for the last 2 years. There is a relative amount of peace. They have no trigger as to why this peace will be disturbed. It's just quite likely that as the central government formalizes, they would possibly offer more and more autonomous power, simply, let's say, written in a constitution that they've newly designed, just like there is autonomous power to Scotland and UK, or there is autonomous power to multiple simple regions throughout the world, where you are still part of the country, but you have your autonomous government. And the only region these people can keep asking for this autonomous government is because they have control over their own area. Because their comparative is, they just give in, they just go into military, and then somehow they get political representation. But their fundamental assertion is that these are minorities and therefore do not have political power within this nation because Sunnis are 60%, which are centrally located, and obviously they want to end the war and they want to consolidate power across all. So when the Deputy Prime Minister tells you that majority of Syrians want this to happen, that is true because majority of them are Sunnis who have been oppressing all other communities for a long period of time. However, the minority of people who are consolidated into different groups, they don't want this because of all the harms that have happened before to them that I will talk about in a while. But currently, there is a deal in place, and as there is formalization of the existing government, it's just likely that they would try to create a constitution. But they try to create a constitution, they would possibly formalize these verbal deals of autonomy with this particular smaller councils. As long as that is true, we will have relative peace on our side of the house. What is lacking right now is a trigger, and our argument is that this specific deal is the trigger that possibly leads to more rearmament and possibly leads to more violence within this region, and therefore disturb the peace that we have achieved after such a long period of time. The first thing I want to talk about is how were these communities treated and why were they even in a civil war. They were in a civil war because for the last 5 decades, they were ruled by a government that was dominated by Sunnis who hated them with all their might and made sure that they took away all their resources. For example, Sunnis took away all the oil wells that they had and all the minerals and took it under the central government and gave them absolutely no share as a part of it. Due to this, all these communities remained extremely poor and had no political participation whatsoever. Second, these people were significantly deprioritized in any nation building programs. They weren't offered jobs because most of the corporations were held by Sunnis and they did not want to hire these people. There was direct discrimination to an extent where their regions, because they were sparsely populated, were given lesser seats in the existing structure, and they were made sure that lesser officials were engaged within the government from these communities. Remember, the same Sunni community still rules within the central government. We have no incentive whatsoever as to why they are going to be so welcoming and offer equal participation to all these people, given they are minorities. Even if they conduct a democratic election, remember, the current one is a dictatorship. We don't know if they are going to be democratic. But even if there is a democratic election, these people are what? 5% of the entire population, each of them, who are not necessarily sure if any of them have the ability to get representation like they talk about. As long as that is true, it is going to happen again where the Sunni community, the existing government, takes away their oil wells that they have control over right now. Right now, these communities control the oil wells in their own area, they get the revenue, they possibly pay a 20% cut to the existing government under the deal, and they make sure that all the money is utilized for their own people and for their own community, and they make sure that this community is taken care of, simply because, like I said, very often the reason why armies exist even within a 5% of the population is because everyone contributes, there is a sense of conscription, and these militias do take care of their own people. As long as that is true, it's quite likely that they are able to derive this revenue and they are able to benefit the minorities that already exist. Second, they have their own international deals. Many of these communities are engaged with Turkey, many of them are engaged with Iran. Very often they have their own international dealings in terms of what to sell and what to buy. These are countries, these are autonomous regions, and therefore very often have the power to remain autonomous. These are regions that can sustain on our side of the house, but will cease to sustain on theirs because of the harms that have occurred. Look at what Assad did to them in the last 20 years. They were bombed, their children were taken away, significant amount of their resources were taken away, and they have the cities that are in ruins. The capital city has still been rebuilt where most of the Sunnis live. If they give up this power, and why will they give up this power? The argument is, well, they can still go into army. Why will they ever want to serve in armies that have killed their own population? Why would I ever work under a general that directly killed my brothers and sisters? It doesn't make sense. So obviously they do not want to work in this army of the central government that has been extremely oppressive for a long period of time. But then they can walk away. But if they walk away, what leverage do they have to get future autonomy? They have absolutely nothing, and therefore nobody joins. I will also argue that the news of the deal itself pushes Iran to fund existing communities, Shia communities, more and more to rearm them, simply because it threatens the Shia crescent that they have created, through which they can depend upon these autonomous regions for refueling, for oil extraction, for any possible support that they are getting right now that did not come under Syria. And therefore, it's quite likely that the moment this deal comes into place, or this deal is even announced, you possibly have more funding of these communities, far more rearmament. So before they were sending children back to school, but now they have to make sure they are able to protect themselves, because the threat of this deal is that they will be disarmed and disbanded. The meaning of that is that we will go attack you and take away everything you have. which means they have no other option but to pull back the children from the school, give guns to the 14-year-olds, and make sure that their militia is created again, recreated again, and is ready for war. So there was no trigger to disturb peace in the valley till now, but now there is a trigger, and this is what scares them, and a lot of communities are going to come back and make sure that possibly their children go back to fighting. The problem is, these kind of deals were offered 15 times in the last 10 years under US and multiple other negotiation channels. They did not accept ever. They have given absolutely no reason as to why. Suddenly people would start accepting. There was a bunch of negotiations in the last 10 years and none of them ever accepted amnesty. They have to fulfill the burden as to why this acceptance would happen.
Thank you, second negative. Now to conclude the substantive portion of Stan Affirmative's case, I welcome up third affirmative.
Three things in this speech, but the first observation I'm going to make is that they spend a lot of that speech claiming, why would you ever accept a deal that you did not accept over the past 15, 20 years? And I think the answer is very simply given earlier on in that speech. It is that you do not accept deals with someone that has killed your family, that has killed your friends, that has bombed you into oblivion. So there is a very simple reason why you don't accept a deal with Assad, and you do accept a deal with a new government that has someone that was factually not part of the previous regime, that was actually part of Al-Qaeda, and in fact, that person is someone that is the head of a new regime, one that looks more stable, one that looks more willing to cooperate with and do more deals on the international stage, one that is less biased, one that is more willing to offer this deal in the first place, notably a deal that is far better than any that were offered in the past 20 years. That is why you accept it, that is clearly why we won this debate. Let's talk about accepting it, let's talk about more stable Syria, but first of all, I'm going to talk about why these groups do not buy more arms, remilitarize, and convert themselves. Two things to say though. First of all, in these conditions, slash by their own analysis, some groups join and others do not, which means, first of all, at that point, the distance between the power of the Syrian government, whose forces have now increased in size from many groups that have surrendered, whose capacity has now increased by the fact that arms have been surrendered, by the fact that they now have control and access to regions of the country and new wealth that they did not have access to earlier, for instance, the oil wells of any groups that did control those wells, now joining them, their capacity actually increases, which is why fighting back looks like a far worse option for you. But second of all, in that circumstance, sections of your group, for instance, see other groups giving up and gaining some potential security, some potential safety, and some involvement in the government, which means that in that circumstance, sections of your group also want to pursue that particular option. They want to give up because they want security for themselves and for their families and for their children. In those circumstances, even if you are not likely to give in and join necessarily, you are still certainly too divided to fight back and remilitarize. You are just fearful that others will leave your group if you put their families more at risk. When divided, you do not take more aggressive action. Note, even if you believe, note, I just think that this goes against the irrational potential fears of these groups as well, because if there is some representation that is achieved by other groups that join first, then it is guaranteed that if you join, you can get representation as well, because you can see success cases first, you can see people getting high positions in the military in other alternative militias. That is the proof of concept that goes against the fact that you will never get representation. But second of all, you can never overcome these capacity problems. They have one response to this, which is to say that foreign militias are likely to support you. But I would point out two things. First of all, the backing of these militias by foreign governments did not help them come to power in the first place. None of these militias won when this government currently did. And clearly, that is where you had the most maximal incentive to invest in these groups, was when there was no government in power, where there was no clear winner of this conflict. That is when all these foreign governments pumped maximal money into these situations. So, clearly, it is not the point where you can increase that much. But second of all, the current government does have some degree of international and US backing, so actively giving more guns to these groups and to these militias is a big risk for pissing off those international powers that are involved. But third of all, on the international stage, stage, you as that country that is attempting to back this militia is just viewed as a far worse actor at this point when you're attempting to attack and undermine a government that is operating in good faith, that is attempting to lay down their weapons and that is attempting to give proportional representation in these governments. So you as Syria, you as Iran, look way, way worse when you fund these groups more instead of trying to secure the rights of the people that you're protecting, which has been your fucking claim this whole time. So that clearly proves why these groups never remilitarize or fight back, why they certainly don't do so successfully, and why foreign governments are unlikely to intervene. So let's talk about the groups accepting in the first place. A few things to say here. First of all, do they consider themselves as a part of Syria / an autonomous region, or an autonomous region under their side? First of all, they were willing to enter agreements with even the Assad government in 2003, which suggests that they are willing to volunteer some sense of autonomy. The Assad government just went back on that. They were the ones that reneged, not these groups themselves. They're willing to compromise on autonomy and sovereignty. But second of all, the current Prime Minister was not part of the regime as we suggested, and even if they were, clearly, it is an anti-Assad section of the former regime. It is just unclear why it came to power after the Assad government fell, was able to pick up and consolidate the power of the military that was against Assad to take the place of it instead. Just unclear why the OIV would believe this alternative. But thirdly, it is just far, far easier to enforce the deal at this point, which is why you accept it. Because there is far more international eyes and oversight on it. There is more involvement of the United Nations, of Europe and the US in this, which mitigates the fear that they renege on that decision because they are to some extent forced to follow through and have oversight from them. Because there is international governance institutions that force them to some extent to be compliant with international law, and notably that the OIV knows they are willing to comply with because they've done things like liberalize and put women in government in order to appease those same international institutions. So they're clearly likely to work with them. They're currently doing so right now, and that oversight is something that means you are less likely to believe that they're going to go back on their deal. That is why you join it, because you do have the potential for political participation. And then at the point where you believe that analysis, they provide the reasons why this meaningful representation is so important to you. Because you've been denied autonomy for 25 years, because you have had no chance to have a say on your people, because you have had no access to government services for the past 20 years, that is the point at which it is far more meaningful to you to join it. But do they have autonomy and riches right now in order to hold out? Maybe they have limited access to things like oil or some trade routes as they explain, but there's four things that they don't have right now which they might want. They have no access to a far greater pool of aid, so maybe they get Turkey, but we get like all of Europe and the US and perhaps the United Nations. That seems more important. It's better if you have access to certain things like health goods and resources. But second of all, they immediately contradict themselves after, because they say for the 20 years previous, these areas were robbed of resources. They were robbed of their minerals, of their oil. So in that circumstance, I guess it's just a little bit unclear why they have such capacity to control it and export it now. But also thirdly, they just did not have democratic participation before in a way that they might get now. For instance, if you are people within the civilian population and not the militias of these groups, you have no say in the control of your autonomous region because it is entirely consolidated power in the top few members of the militias that are currently controlling that are completely top-down structures. So in this circumstance, it is maybe more autonomy if you can put pressure on your militia to accept it, and they get some say in the government via your representatives. But fourthly, you just do need eventually to secure better access to the economy other than basic necessities and resources. You want a future for yourself and your children. You want the potential access to government-run education systems when you cannot afford education otherwise. You want potentially the ability to set up a business in the long term that will support you and support your family. Those are things which you cannot do without capital, without security, and importantly, where there is still conflict, which is why you're incentivized to join it and not fight back. But second of all, these are just people that are tired of conflict. It has been 15 years that they have lived in these wars. They are unwilling to support them any longer. They are unwilling and they are frustrated and they are just unlikely to try and hold out in autonomous regions. And I would suggest their analysis says that you're afraid of the government attacking you afterwards. So if you don't join the deal, and your fear is that not joining the deal, the government will attack you afterwards, being tired of war and conflict and wanting a future means you just are more likely to join that deal. Even if you're afraid for coercive reasons, we would suggest that's kind of okay in some circumstances. The final thing is they say, why would they ever accept a deal with people that hurt them the most in the war? But I would suggest not only for the reasons that I explained in my introduction, they just do in some circumstances, but second of all, just because they have to. Because we explain that it secures them greater political participation, greater access to material goods, greater support from the international community to get access to the goods and the opportunities that they care about more than anything else. Their final claim is that these people only joined these militias in the first place for reasons of autonomy, but I would just flip this and explain that many of them joined because of survival, because you had no other option, because there was not a better way to get autonomy. But in this circumstance, this is your best bet. This is your best path forward, and is the best path for Syrian autonomy and Syrian freedom. The final thing I'm going to talk about here is just way a more stable Syria. Since 2011, these people have been mired in conflict. Their economy has been decimated. They are tired of war. Keeping them from that conflict again for as long as possible is by far the most crucial thing. And even if it means that some groups join and some groups stay autonomous and do not join, the fact that it is more stable because these smaller groups never want to fight back against a government that is more powerful than them is better than nothing. That means that some regions have better access to government services, and at least you are in a stable stable standoff between the two with no possibility of conflicts because there is a disproportionate difference in the capacity of those actors. And they never explain why the government would then attack these autonomous regions on their own when they also care about continuing to set up the infrastructure of government in their own circumstance. So if there's no aggression from the smaller party that is less powerful because they can't win, and if there's no aggression from the big party because they want to secure their future and they want to set up a real fucking government, I just think this has to be a very clear affirmative win. Socioeconomics.
Speaker for that speech. Now to conclude the substantive portion of side negative's case, and the substantive portion of this debate as a whole, along with one half the third negative. Here.
I'll speak without the mark. Hope that's fine. Ready? Team Affirmative thinks Syria is Australia, that you will liberalize women, that you will go ahead and give more representation to women because just because you have a US support in the first place, and for you to get the legitimacy, you need to follow through your promises, maintain peace, conduct free and fair elections as opposed to the consolidation power incentives that you have, due to which you are manifesting these policies to get these people into the military and have monopolistic power as opposed to a sectarian power which is autonomous. Against all these incentives, why is it that the person is so good? Their naive argument is just that, bro, like Sharaa is not Bashar, he's so good that he'll introduce democracy. There is a simple reason why this is false. Sharaa has to follow through his promises to retain the perception of legitimacy by US, and he needs US support as the feminist. This is an assertion. Why is this the follow through of promises or any other things that they say? The tipping point for US or Western support in the first place, provided there is no freedom of press, transparency of media, or there is no leeway for information dissemination to happen to the Western world, or even if it happens, why does an average European or a US voter care about Syria as opposed to more proximate things to impose political pressure on the politicians or congressmen? These are equally competing reasons as to why this is true. But I'll not stop at this. But there are huge analysis as to why this is not a tipping point, as to why US will support him anyway. This takes down the big metric, takes down a premise due to which impacts follow through downstream. The first thing is just that Sharaa to US is just what Bashar was to Russia. He's a US puppet who's a counterbalance to Iran's expansion of Shia crescent in the region. Why does Shia crescent matter so much to these, too much to the US state apparatus? Shia crescent gives land corridor to the Mediterranean to Iran, which matters to US because this is what enables Iran to fund Hezbollah and Hamas or do arms transfer to Hezbollah and Hamas, and which is a huge leeway for regional power projection by Iran. And this is a strategic threat to Israel and other US allies that are more proximate to them, like Saudi Arabia. All of this means you have more crucial reasons to support Sharaa anyways, because you fear that someone who is backed by Russia or China like Bashar will come in. So you want to retain the status quo anyways. I'm sure why this is the tipping point. This response is important because it proves that Sharaa doesn't have to follow up on its promise, restore democracy, keeping promise, or liberal representation in the first place. The second thing that I will do is just that I will not just symmetricize them, I will actually flip them. Why will Al-Sharaa actually crack down even if these people integrate? The premise that we have been repeating throughout the debate, that is a fact, is that Syria is comprised, or the state apparatus of Syria and the status quo is comprised of hardline Sunni majority. So there are three logical reasons why this is true, even if you don't believe this AIV part. The first is Al-Sharaa was the leader of HTS. HTS was comprised of 5 different rebel groups that were comprised of Sunni majority Islamists. But the problem with extremists, or that they are extremists, they hold extremist ideology. You can tone down the indoctrination that has happened to a person years ago, due to which they were able to take up arms, risk their lives, and everything else, and just because you give them power, you don't take that away. Which then means the internal hate, or the internal discrimination, or the internal bias against these people would still exist for the majority of people within this. This is also a perception of threat to these minorities in the first place. The second is majority of people in Syria is empirically Sunni. What this then means is, even if the first reason is not true, you need to appease the majority of state apparatus, because majority of state apparatus like bureaucrats and stuff like that are likely to be from the Sunni majority, because most Sunni majority are comprised and concentrated in urban centers of Syria. What this then means is, when you have an appeasement incentive to retain your power, you will go ahead and do the same thing. The reason why Sunni majority hates these people the most is because these are the same militias that they were told that are killing their children, that are going ahead and doing all of these things under Bashar's regime. All of this is why they hate them. The third is, in order for him to retain his power, it just means that you have to go ahead and have a unilateral majority or cater to the majority and give them all these resources. So even if you don't explicitly oppress them, it's just that the extent of resources these minorities will get, the extent of government care that these minorities will get will be far lower. What is the comparative even right now? Anshuman and Raghav repeat 8 times as if there is a concession deal between these autonomous regions or these different groups and the central government, that you will give 20 to 30% of your oil and mineral revenues as opposed to the autonomy that you have. What this then means is that this 70 to 60% money that you have is great enough for you to do all these things, and don't believe their case or their possible responsive reply on these oil is the incentive or minerals are the incentive for Syrian government to go ahead and invade them and capture these resources. These are not just present in these provinces, they are also present in majority controlled provinces, so the marginal incentive is quite limited as opposed to the risk that might exist. All of these means Al-Sharaa would actually crack down even if they integrate in their best case. I want to now disintegrate their mean metric. Their mean metric is, hey, these militias fight between each other, at a point which they posit that when they fight between each other and when you demilitarize them, violence decreases. I want to tackle both premises of them fighting between each other and them fighting with the broader state. The first premise as to why they are not fighting with each other, which is logical, is that they have a huge logical contradiction. Is that they say Jews are 15%, Alawites are 10% in the starting of their game speech. If this is the case, why would a minority perceive another minority as a threat and as a consequence fight with each other, as opposed to Al-Sharaa and HCS, which is filled with majority Sunni hardliners, as I just told, manifesting more threat. So even when you are ambiguous, if whatever we are saying is OAV, you should take this logical contradiction into consideration as to why you would do this. The second is these different groups have self-preservation incentives. So unless and until they are, they have a threat, or there is someone who is actually incursioning into their land, why would anyone invade another person's or another minority's group, provided that they live in separate autonomous regions and there is a broader threat for them? And the third thing that's the most effective response is that both sides consider that these different minorities were oppressed by this broader state of Syria for a long time. What this then means is that when you have a threat of a larger state, it is unstrategic as a militant group to fight against a smaller group at a point the threat exists both sides. Every bullet that is shot by a Jew on an Alawite is every less bullet that you have against the broader Syrian government at a point Al-Sharaa might invade you, and this is the rhetoric that exists behind the existence of all these militias. All of this is why they will not fight. They are not fighting between each other. They will not fight between each other. Why did they not engage in violence against Al-Sharaa? 2 reasons. First is that they don't have any expansionist incentive. Their rhetoric predominantly always has been that they don't engage to, always has been that we have to be defensive, we need to protect our regions against the broader state governments. It's not that they have ambitions to take over the entirety of Syria in the first place. The land borders of these autonomous regions have been remained quite constant. The second is they themselves say that these militants know that it's unstrategic for them to go against the state itself as a mechanism for why they will opt in. This is the reason why they will not go against the state in terms of the violence, which means the mean metric is just gone. What then is the comparative? The comparative is just that you let them be, you take the concessions, you take 20 to 30% of foiled reviews, you let them be anonymous. But what I'll do just now is just take down their mechanisms on why these people opt in. The first thing that they say is, bro, you get more involvement in the new government, it's an incentive. I've provided a number of reasons why this new government will not accept you because of the Sunni majority appeasing incentives, especially in the presence of Sunni hardliners that were a part of HTS, which was led by Sharaa, to take over this regime. The second thing is, I said, they say even if some take a deal, others take a deal. Basically, they suggest this leads to some sort of snowball effect once a group takes a deal. The first is they will be called traitors by their own group and upon which they take the deal. Probably the rhetoric has been that, we need to defend our land, we need to do so many things, and you have taken the lives of our brothers and sisters, we have sacrificed it, and you are now like giving up to the traitor in and of itself. The second is that by seeing this becomes a precedent for other groups to not do so. And the third is a basic burden fulfillment. Why would any group, why would the first group even accept it in the first place, right? So you don't have to believe the 100% of a case to manifest 100% of the impact. The impact is already explained on layers in Raghav's speech.
Thanks, the negative, to open up the reply portion of this debate, I think the time to hold, and to include the negative case, I welcome up negative reply.
Government is amazing because they give very beautiful impacts. The problem with their impacts is that all of that is dependent upon people joining Al-Sharaa, and second, after they join, Al-Sharaa being really kind and nice to them. They have never really proven why Al-Sharaa is really good or why this government has really benevolent incentives. Vishwa does point out, and I have pointed out in my speech, that almost all of these groups were militants who were fighting one another, have deep-rooted hatred between them. Their only response is, well, they were fighting Assad and not Al-Sharaa, but Al-Sharaa was one of the strict Sunni Muslim majority group that was also fighting all these groups, and there was a civil war on multiple fronts between these minorities and the Sunni majority and Al-Assad group. As long as that war existed, that the feelings of hatred still do exist, and therefore we are unsure as to why they go and work in the same army, and they have such a nice brotherhood, and they become a democracy with equal representation to all communities, and everyone is happy. We have explained to you that no government in Syria before have allocated resources to these communities. These are communities that were deprived of their resources because they are minorities which are not liked by Sunnis, and that hatred has only increased, as Vishwa explains, because there was a civil war and Sunni children were killed by these minorities, and they hate these minorities even more. We are very, very unclear as to why there would be a democratic government and there would be benefits. So regardless of their beautiful speeches, the fundamental problem is they do not prove the premise, and it is only asserted if the premise is asserted. And what is their premise? It's US-backed, and therefore it will be liberal. Saudi Arabia is US-backed, not liberal. Multiple other countries are US-backed, not liberal. Vishwa tells you that very often US simply backed this nation to counteract the Shia Christian created by Iran, which is just factually true. They have given no reason as to why, if US and EU back somebody, they are liberal. US is also backing the Afghanistan government a little bit right now, not liberal at all. The second thing is that they say they have selected women in positions of power, Sunni women, not minority women or minorities. Just because they put women in some positions of power doesn't mean they would give benefits to all the minorities out there. The other thing they say is that this particular government has some certain kind of benefits within the capital. Yes, they are rebuilding the capital. They are trying to appease the Sunni majority who lives in the capital. We are very unclear how does this give any confidence to the minorities out there who have been living peacefully since 2024 because there hasn't been any major war. We have given you the comparative already. These are communities that have gone back from war into schools and into work and into rebuilding within their own area because they are not stupid and they want to live as well. However, at the point when you threaten them, and this is what they never engage with, because the info slide does indicate that there is a threat. If you do not join us, we will go and kill you or disband you, which means kill you, which very often means that this particular policy itself triggers the need for these communities to rearm, triggers the need for these communities to pull people out of school, pull people out of work, stop functioning of all of that, and create an army even more stronger again. And they do get funding, they do get backing. We did tell you that the civil war existed for so long means that all of them are certainly quite powerful. They just say, oh, all of them are so weak. weak, they would be scared of the center, and they would all accept. Why? Given they weren't scared of the center for the last 20 years, they would suddenly be scared now of a government that has much less power than Al-Assad. It absolutely makes no sense. So as long as their premise is not true, our premise is true, and therefore you should credit us. Our impacts do not require a high threshold. The moment they see the threat of being disbanded, they pull capital, they pull children out of school, they pull people out of work, which in and of itself is a huge harm. They also re-arm themselves, and therefore the tensions increase, due to which a war again can become imminent, and the threat of the war itself is a huge harm because they spend most of their money on arms, they spend more of their manpower on arms. As long as our impacts are a direct stream of the motion itself indicates our impact, and therefore we should win this debate. Their impact depends upon Al-Assad being extremely nice. They are not, and you shouldn't buy it, proud to oppose.
Thanks for taking the reply. To conclude the reply portion of this debate, Affirmative's case and the debate as a whole, Affirmative reply.
Allowing armed militias to govern portions of a country is not stability. This team tries to claim that it is. We provide a few responses. On autonomous regions, the first is that we explain that this deal is likely to preserve autonomy to the extent that it's important, or as important as this team says. And that's because if Sharaa, underside negative, is content not invading or claiming these regions under the counterfactual, it demonstrates that he is okay with a relative degree of autonomy. This claim underlies the entire case, which means that he is okay with them having a degree of sovereignty and control in exchange for greater stability and a broader operation in Syria. But secondly, we explain that this is how you convince other groups to join, that if this is the thing holding them from, joining, or conceding to whatever this deal is called, then you've got a very strong incentive to offer it to the ones who joined initially so that it can be effective overall and that is powerful. Finally, we explain that this is important if it's going to prevent but finally, we explain, that means that there's a pretty good chance that autonomy and political legitimization occurs under the deal. The second thing, though, is I just think we query the power of autonomy as a reason not to accept this. And that's because we explain that autonomy only matters to these people to the extent that it has been necessary for security and survival when they have been living under a regime that has not accepted or included them. But to the extent that they feel that there is hope here, that there is the possibility for integration, most people would not fight for autonomy if they can guarantee better access to economic support, to schooling for their children, and to stability. And this is far more likely to be stable. Firstly, it removes the threat of conflict at any point in the future. You don't have to be worried about al-Sharaa changing his mind or someone else getting into power and then taking away your autonomy. Secondly, we say that it allows you to access national resources, whether that's national markets and the national economy, whether that's things like schooling and education funding, and that is massively important to the people. This team concedes that individuals in these groups are willing to cooperate to the government to the extent that they send, for example, oil revenue to join them. That is a demonstration that they are willing to operate in some sort of broader federal agreement or government under which they would have some power. Finally, I question the impact at this point. They say you militarise more. We query why this is not already maximised to the extent that this threat exists, and you are aware that there is a military and a government that may want to take you over. Secondly, we query from who? The Middle East is obviously exceptionally stretched right now. Guns are deployed in a range of areas. Is it likely Iran's going to be sending more into Syria or using them themselves? But finally, I think it's unclear what the difference is. This team concedes that these regions are already armed. If the stockpile is larger, if the stockpile is bigger, that is far less of an impact in the regions that don't accede as to the ones that do, which are now completely demilitarized, where there are no guns, where people can feel safe and secure. We give 4 reasons why people are likely to join. The first is we just explained that amnesty is appealing, but often these are people who, for example, did things during the Civil War that they were worried about being prosecuted for, and this guarantees a degree of personal safety. Secondly, we explain that the threat is credible, that the government has power, particularly if some accede, to be able to come in and disband you, and that is a good reason to want to do this. Thirdly, we explain that political participation is how you get real representation and autonomy. Living as an illegitimate government inside a bigger state is not satisfactory to these groups, and they would rather operate to have something better, to have better representation. Finally, we explain that you only need some within a region to go. If there are a few leaders within the Druze district in the south who are willing to join this deal, then it creates division and it makes it untenable to continue that region autonomously, which means that everybody has to go, and I think it's likely that some agree. But even if you think that some autonomous regions see them be prosecuted and experience things like retribution. These groups under our side have no reason that this team provides not to demilitarize, and that is just a win. But secondly, the counterfactual has never defended this team. Why is Assad, who at times they claim wants centralization and power, whenever they respond to our mix about why he's going to be good, not going to send in the troops under our side? At least under our side, they don't have to do it in all regions. Some have receded. But finally, sending in the troops is good. These groups are violent, they create fear, they cut people off from the national autonomy, from the national economy, and they're bad to minorities in the region. If we have to behead them, we're more than okay doing that.
Thanks for the reply, and I'd like to ask you again for one more round of applause for the debate. Thank you very much. I think the panel can go occupy 101 for deliberation.
Great idea, Bruce. Did you not think of that?